I have some questions about, particularly in the early days, how you taught system dynamics. One of the things I'm always impressed with in leafing through industrial dynamics is you have a number well, you report on a number of studies that were done by, I gather, what were Sloan Fellows at the time. And I would gather that building system dynamics models at that point was considerably more difficult in terms of the logistics than it is today, where every student has 2 or 3 laptops that they bring with them to class, and the software is quite accessible. So I'd be interested in hearing sort of what you taught in the courses, who took them, and how it is that people were able to do such remarkable things when I would imagine the technology at that point was considerably more awkward than it is today.
Well, the technology at that time were mainframe computers over here in the main institute, and I think the model was punched up on punch cards with a key punch, delivered to the center, and the next day you would get back one specified computer run. It had some advantages. You did a lot of thinking in between these. You really had to ponder what you were doing. There was probably a discipline on thinking about the problem that people now don't have to subject themselves to so much. But still, to get the model in the first place was a matter of drawing ideas from real life. A lot of those models were now, in retrospect, very much more complicated than they needed to be. But there were various interesting responses. One Sloan Fellow who built a model of an automobile company and its problems, and he got through it, he said, "I had no idea I knew so much about my company." In other words, the model draws you into what's happening here, what's happening there. He knows, but he would never have known that he could actually sit down and essentially put the whole thing together based on his experience, which is to indicate the vast amount of information people have in their heads that generally they don't realize they have, and which they can never use dynamically in a reliable way. But to illustrate the overcomplication, there is one of those models that has hundreds of equations in it, and a very interesting outcome about the relationship between lead time, how far ahead of time do you freeze the design of an automobile. The longer the lead time, the better quality you can work into the design. But the less timely it will be. That was in an era when style was changing rapidly, and the less opportunity you had to match the current nature of the stylistic demands. It was basically that trade-off. It was a big, complicated model. I found myself invited to address some executives of an automobile company in a meeting in New York one day, and I thought, well, I'll try to use this on them. And on the train on the way down, I did a hand simulation of that on paper, pulling out essentially the essence of that particular relationship, which of course touches on, I think, a lot of the current model building, that it's too complicated. It has a lot more in it than necessary for the essential insights that you can get from it.
How about the content of the courses during that period of time?
Well, I would say they probably taught the methodology, the idea of feedback systems, how you write rate equations, how you write level stock equations. There were examples to draw on. The Industrial Dynamics book was in process or written so that the ideas that are in it were being taught. And then those models you speak of were master's theses done by Sloan Fellows. And there are some very interesting ones there. For example, going into the soft variables, a man, I think, was Abe Katz from RCA, did a master's thesis on the nature of research and development management, including the matter of integrity as it affects bidding on military contracts. And that master's thesis was really the foundation for Ed Roberts' doctoral thesis, where he elaborated it, filled it in, looked more deeply into it, but it was kind of the opening wedge on that particular line of attack. There have been others. There were others on corporate growth. A number of them are identified in in the industrial dynamics work. And basically, they grew out of problems that the individuals, the Sloan Fellows from companies, felt were important to them, and out of conferences, discussions with them, kind of leading them to think about what they really knew, leading them to set down the relationships which they already had in mind, which they could then begin to explore as to whether those relationships led to what they thought they led to or not, that coming out of the simulations.
Did you find in those early years that the students who had been exposed to system dynamics sometime during their MIT experience then went out and actually tried to use these concepts or tools in their own organizations? So some of these Sloan Fellows who might have done a model here during their program, was that their end of system dynamics, or did they go out and start influencing their organizations?
Very few probably went out to do models, to make models. But I'm sure that they all had a different view of life. They all had additional insights from that experience that would be brought to bear on their future activities and decisions in varying degrees.
Did you teach primarily Sloan Fellows?
No. The Sloan Fellows were in, for the most part, I think, courses open to other students. One interesting thing is that there were a number, through those years, there were several students from Japan who were sons of founder families of the big Japanese companies. And they took the ideas back and more or less had a network around system dynamics. And in some ways, I think Japan got more quickly into system dynamics than this country or most other countries. For example, my World Dynamics book, while I was writing it, before I had decided on an American publisher, I had a request from a Japanese publisher for the right to translate it. Frank Davidson, one of our colleagues here, told me once that he had gone to Japan to attend a conference on cities. And he said every prefecture, every state in Japan was there with a system dynamics model of what they were talking about. We don't see that, as far as I know, here. And usually, the key system dynamics books have been translated into Japanese very early in their careers of the books.